Я Володимир Панченко, президент клубу «КОЛО» і заступник голови правління Міжнародного центру перспективних досліджень, в приміщенні якого ми всі перебуваємо. Ця організація є мозковим центром, який вже на протязі більше 15 років консультує уряд України, а також неурядові організації і бізнеси. Основні завдання, які виконує Міжнародний центр перспективних досліджень, це інституційна спроможність України до реформ. Клуб «КОЛО» є об'єднанням бізнесменів і чиновників, а також інтелектуалів, які замовляють продукти, пов'язані із стратегіями розвитку різних галузей і економіки в цілому. Ми дуже радо сприйняли запрошення поговорити з Деном Мітчелом, представником мозкового центру КАТО з Сполучених Штатів Америки. Ви про це все читали в інтернеті. І, мабуть, треба тобі виступити, потім.
Дуже дякую також всім, що ви прийшли. Сьогодні, я розумію, вихідний, було тяжко вирватися на цю зустріч. Я представляю рух «За сталий розвиток», це нова, більше проконсервативна організація. Одна з наших цілей – це також вироблення стратегії розвитку України, економічного розвитку України. Ми з великою радістю маємо можливість сьогодні послухати видатного теоретика питання податкування пана Мітчела. Також дякую нашим партнерам з клубу «КОЛО» і ЦКД за гостинність в цьому закладі. Я думаю, найближчим часом у нас буде ряд заходів різного плану, політичних, трошки таких, швидше політично-ідеологічних, культурних. Слідкуйте з нашим оголошенням. Дякую. Володя? Ти хочеш зараз, може, просто дамо слово одразу?
Ні, я просто оголошу формат. Ми домовилися, що Деніл робить спіч на протязі 30 хвилин, можливо, коротше. І ми основну частину часу повинні уділити запитанням і запитанням-відповідям. Тобто, я думаю, він представить і свою організацію, і свій проєкт, тому прохання, коли будете представлятися, коли будете задавати запитання або виступати з якимись думками в дискусії, представлятися, тому що ми один одного не знаємо, зібралися, я думаю, це буде важливо, цікаво. І прохання, якщо це будуть довгі виступи, то про це попереджати, але я думаю, що це переважно повинні бути короткі виступи і короткі запитання, щоб дати можливість нашому основному спікеру розкрити ту тему, з якою він сюди приїхав. Тому, будь ласка, вам.
Okay. All right, well, so just so I understand, I'll just talk and you'll interpret to her, so I don't stop and wait for you to say yes. Okay.
Yeah, but maybe a little bit slower.
Yes, nice and slow. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here. Oh, I don't get my soda in the. I'm here to talk about taxes, but you can't talk about taxes without talking about spending. And if you're trying to figure out fiscal policy and the economy, you also have to recognize that there are other policies that are important. If you look at the Economic Freedom of the World Index, published by the Fraser Institute, there are 5 big categories that each are responsible for 20% of a nation's grain. Fiscal policy is one, so that's 20% is fiscal policy, 20% is trade policy, 20% is regulation, 20% is property rights, rule of law, and then monetary policy. So there are lots of things that are very, very important. We're just talking about fiscal policy. So if a country does fiscal policy right, but does everything else wrong, it's still going to be in trouble. If a country does everything else right and fiscal policy wrong, well, then they might still be okay. Maybe Sweden would be an example. Sweden has a very big government, very high taxes, but they're very free market in all these other ways, and I think that helps the Swedish economy continue to do reasonably well. So we're focusing on this 20% of fiscal policy, but really we're just focusing on 10% because we're focusing on the tax side. And so, if you divide 20% in half, 10% taxes, 10% spending. But I don't want to ignore spending because I want to make one very important point. You can't have a good tax system if you have a big government. Because if you have a big government, you're going to have high tax rates. And the number one thing that public finance economists will always tell students or politicians who are very bad students, we will always say, keep tax rates low. But if you have a very big government, if you have a Swedish-sized government with government more than 50% of GDP, you're going to have high tax rates. Especially when you combine social insurance taxes, income taxes, value-added taxes, energy taxes, you wind up with just a very, very heavy tax burden. So even though my speech is on taxes, I want to make sure nobody forgets one of the most important lessons, which is that if you have a big government, you can't have a good tax system. It's going to be very, very difficult. So let me talk specifically about some of the principles of good tax policy. I already mentioned keep tax rates low. Why do you want to keep tax rates low? You want to keep tax rates low because a tax is a price that government is imposing on whatever is being taxed. Now that sounds circular, but let me give you an example. Politicians in America, maybe in Ukraine, politicians always say, we need higher taxes on tobacco because we want people to smoke fewer cigarettes. And from an economic perspective, they're right. The more you tax tobacco higher, the fewer cigarettes people will smoke. So their economic analysis is correct. But let's now think about taxes on work, saving, investment, entrepreneurship, all the things that cause an economy to grow. Well, just as higher taxes on tobacco lead to less smoking, higher taxes on work, saving, investment, entrepreneurship lead to less economic output. So you want to keep tax rates low on things that are good for the economy. You want to make sure people have an incentive to produce. You want them to have an incentive to engage in what we call productive behavior. Again, the work, saving, investment, entrepreneurship. So keeping the tax rates low is very important. But you also want to make sure you don't double tax income more than one time. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'll give you an example from the US because we make a very big mistake in the US. Between the capital gains tax, the corporate income tax, the personal income tax, and the death tax, a single dollar of income in America can be taxed 4 different times.
Може перекладіть це ще раз для публіки.
Please read one more time. Sorry.
About these taxes.
Taxes.
We have taxes that layer upon each other or cascade upon each other. So if you earn income and you pay tax on your income, you have 2 choices of what to do with that income. You can consume it or you can save and invest it. In America, if you consume your after-tax income, the government leaves you alone. Then we have no value-added tax or national sales tax. If you save and invest your after-tax income, then you get all this cascading. Capital gains tax, corporate income tax, double tax on dividends, and the death tax. So it's possible for a single dollar of income to be taxed 4 different times. Not all the time, sometimes only twice, sometimes 3 times, but always more than once.
Ну, просто я чому заострив на цю увагу? Вони в Америці зробили, на його думку, велику помилку, тому що оподатковують ті прибутки після виплати, прибутки населення після виплати вже податку, вони ще раз 4 рази оподатковують. У них є цей каскадний податок, який він називає, тобто спочатку податок на...
Якщо людина отримує прибуток, людина сплачує податок, у неї залишається якийсь прибуток, людина просто його зберігає. Тобто людина робить...
Якщо тратить,
If consume...
Перше, що тут говориться, є податок на прибуток підприємства, акціонерних ділянок. You're talking about corporation tax. First of all, income tax, right? And when the dividends are paid, you pay, as a person, you pay for that tax, right? And what are the...
And then we have a death tax. So if you're a successful person with some assets, you have corporate stock, you have these 2 layers of tax, and then you have another layer of tax when you die. But then, don't forget, a capital gains tax is a tax on the expectation of future income. So the capital gains tax is on top of it all. And the point I'm making is that even if your tax rates are low, when you tax 1, 2, 3, 4 times, then effectively your tax rates can be high. And the reason this is very counterproductive is that every single economic theory, even Marxism, every economic theory agrees you have to have saving and investment to have future economic growth. You have to set aside some of today's income to finance tomorrow's growth.
Є перший податок на прибуток підприємства, яке заробило гроші. Людина, яка інвестор в неї вклала гроші, вона отримує дивіденди. Цей самий прибуток розподіляється серед багатьох інвесторів, так? І інвестор ще як особа платить за цей прибуток. І потім, коли вона помирає, вона передає комусь іншому ще один податок на ці самі гроші, які вже будуть сплачені на спадок, на те саме.
Мається на увазі, що взагалі, якщо ви тратите або зберігаєте гроші, це один підхід, але якщо ви хочете гроші влити знову в економіку, інвестувати їх кудись, то треба заплатити і іноді 2 рази, іноді 4 рази, тобто в залежності від ситуації. Тобто податки, як і у нас, накладаються каскадом один на інший.
Добре, я вибачаю, що я перебуваю, мабуть, теж, якщо комусь щось неясно вже в тонкощах, прохання зупиняти, і ми краще пройдемося, тому що якщо для нас треба послухати англійську мову, то це на курсах англійської мови. Якщо нам треба розібратися в тому, що він критикує, то краще менше послухати, але розібратися. Окей?
Alright, so the first lesson, keep tax rates low. Second lesson, don't double tax saving and investing. And then the third lesson is you want to have a very neutral tax system, no loopholes, no special favors in the tax system. If you do all these things, a low tax rate, no double taxation, no loopholes, your tax system won't be good for the economy, but it will collect money in the least damaging way possible. And that's the goal. Taxes are like throwing sand into an engine. It's not good for the engine. The engine is the economy. So you want to have as little sand in the engine as possible. And so a low rate, no double taxation, no loopholes, that should be the goal of tax policy in Ukraine, in the United States, in Hong Kong, in Sweden, every country. Now, Hong Kong actually does it that way. Hong Kong has a low rate, no double taxation, very simple, flat tax. There's no value-added tax. no social insurance taxes, just one low level of tax on individuals, one low level of tax on companies. So that's the model. When I'm talking to politicians in the US, I talk about Hong Kong as a role model because it's not perfect, but they're doing it right. Now, one of the reasons that Hong Kong is doing it right is because government is relatively small, about 20% of GDP. In the US, government is almost 40% of GDP.
Зрозуміло, що таке government? Government – це не уряд, а бюджет.
You mean government as a budget?
Yeah, government spending. The government, you know, if your economy is this big, how much does government take? Some of it takes through taxes, some of it takes through borrowing, but here's your economy, maybe government spending is this much.
It was just about this slang.
Okay. And that's why I said at the beginning of my remarks, you can't have a good tax system if government is too big. And government in Ukraine is more than 40% of GDP, at least according to the estimates. You know, I'm sure the underground economy is large, and so it's harder to measure. But that's the challenge, because even though a lot of people look at the income tax in Ukraine and say, "Oh, that's not bad." What is it still 15%? Okay, so it's gone up.
If you mean corporations, it's 20%.
Well, for individuals.
13.
Okay. So
17.
now, well,
Nobody pays taxes. Who more?
Там біля 40%.
but here's the problem, is that sometimes a country, like I know in some of the former communist countries and the transition economies, there are a lot of countries with flat taxes. And they say, well, look, we have a flat tax like Hong Kong. And yeah, that's good, but all of these transition economies also have very high social insurance taxes. All of these transition economies have very high value-added taxes. So what is a value-added tax? What is a value-added tax? It's something that reduces the amount of money you earn versus what you can actually consume and enjoy. Now, you might earn this much, but social insurance taxes mean this. Income taxes mean this. Value-added taxes mean this. Because at the end of the day, what determines your incentive to earn money, also what determines your incentive to comply with the tax system and not go in the black economy, is how hard do you have to work and how much do you actually get to enjoy to spend on yourself and your family when all the taxes are paid. And in Hong Kong, there's only that one tax. Whereas in a lot of the transition economies that have flat taxes, they're very proud of these flat taxes, but they also have the social insurance tax and the high value-added taxes. And why do they have these things? They have these things because government is too big. So now let's talk about what should Ukraine do. 10 things, 20 things. There's I don't know if you have the phrase magic bullet, silver bullet, just one thing you do that solves the problems. No, that doesn't exist in any country. Ukraine could do something very dramatic, like I looked at some of the IMF data. Some of your taxes don't collect much revenue as a share of GDP. Like individual income tax doesn't collect much money. Get rid of it. And then market yourself as a tax haven. Or dramatically lower a tax, understanding that maybe you'll get this effect where people will be more likely to pay if the rate is low than if the rate is high and they go in the black economy. Or you could perhaps try to become a tax haven. Now that's tricky. Because if you try to become a tax haven, what is a tax haven? A tax haven is a country that basically says, we're not going to help enforce the bad tax laws of another country. So Switzerland is a tax haven because they don't let foreign governments know who owns the bank accounts. But Ukraine wants to be friendly with the European Union. So if Ukraine tried to become a tax haven, the people in Brussels and Paris and Berlin would get very upset. Because they're very high tax countries, they're all going bankrupt, and they want to try to stop tax havens. So that makes it very difficult. If you become a tax haven, yes, it's good for your economy, and I do a lot of work trying to defend tax havens and defend tax competition, so I think they're good, but I also want to be very realistic in the advice I give. If Ukraine becomes a tax haven, at least in the way that Switzerland is, then you have a big challenge that the European Union will be very upset and try to sanction you and punish you. But you can be a tax haven in different ways. You can have a shipping registry like Panama or Liberia. You're on the Black Sea. You know, makes sense. It'd be Croatia, not on the Black Sea, but Adriatic Sea. They have a shipping registry. You can do company formation. You know, it's not just bank accounts like Switzerland. There are different ways that you can become a tax haven. But the one way that the European Union can't get upset about is if you become a tax haven where the rules apply to domestic people the same way they do to foreigners. The whole purpose of being a tax haven is you're trying to attract investment from around the world. It's sort of a shortcut to economic growth. Instead of having to build your savings and capital over time yourself, you can import the capital and it enables you to make big jumps in your living standards and catch up to the West. But the problem is, if all you do is offer special rules for foreigners that you don't offer to your own people, that's where you then get the European Union, the World Trade Organization. You start running into all these obstacles. And the way you avoid those obstacles is to figure out what are the policies that we can offer to our own people that are also very attractive to foreigners. And that's where, you know, if you figured out some way to have a zero personal income tax, a zero corporate income tax, you know, look at your fiscal data, look at where you're not collecting much money anyhow, and then say, okay, well, if we're only collecting 2% of GDP for this tax, and we could actually market ourselves and become well known around the world by getting rid of this tax, we're only losing 2% of revenue, maybe the additional money we would bring into our economy would be worth it. But it all depends. You have to look at your forecast, how you would make up for the revenue. Can you figure out some way to control government spending so that you can afford to just cut the tax and match it by controlling the size of government? These are things that every country goes through, because every country, especially given the world economy the way it is right now, countries are trying to figure out how can they market themselves to bring the capital in. Some countries like Singapore and Switzerland, they almost have to turn the money away because so much money wants to go to those jurisdictions, because, you know, look at what's happening in Spain and look at what's happening in Italy, and the United States is going to be in trouble because Bush and Obama are big spenders. So many countries around the world are doing bad things. Look at Argentina, they're just nationalizing companies. So investors are looking for safe havens. They're looking for places to invest, places that they can trust. But let me underline that word trust. Because if you look at the Economic Freedom of the World Index, Ukraine does not get a good score. Why does Ukraine not get a good score? Well, remember, there's 5 categories. One of the areas where Ukraine gets the lowest score is property rights, rule of law. So it doesn't matter what tax system you put in place, or I suppose it matters, but you might not get the full benefits of putting in place good tax policy unless you can convince international investors unless you can convince multinational companies that if you bring money to Ukraine, if you invest money in Ukraine, not only is your tax law good, but we're not going to cheat you in our court system. You're not going to be subjected to corruption by bureaucrats trying to get bribes. And so this sort of brings me back to where I started, where I said there are these 5 different categories. If your regulation is too high, if your rule of law isn't strong, you know, and those, if I remember correctly, those were the 2 areas that Ukraine needed some help. You have to marry good tax policy to good spending policy, but you also have to marry good fiscal policy to all these other areas as well. So I guess let me conclude and summarize by saying that there are several good tax reforms that I think would help Ukraine become competitive. There are some that would help domestically. There are, and I suppose let me just cite one example. Social insurance taxes. Social insurance taxes are high. What does that do? It means people want to work under the table in the black economy. That's obviously not good for the economy. Now, the IMF, if the IMF was in the room, they would say, no, you have to keep your social insurance taxes high because you need the revenue. But if your social insurance taxes are so high that people are under the table, then you're not getting the revenue anyhow. But ultimately, if you want to try to figure out how to lower the rate and improve the compliance, you probably also need to figure out how to control government spending. And the one rule I have for government spending that I think is very important is government spending should grow slower than the private economy. If your private economy, on average, grows 5% a year, you know, nominal, then you should make sure government spending only grows 2 or 3%. Because you know, it's all about trend lines. Greece got in trouble because every year, on average, government spending was growing like this, and the private economy is growing like that. And you keep those 2 lines going out long enough, and you wind up with giant deficits and debt, and you get a fiscal crisis. And that's what happened to Greece. It's going to happen to the United States. You know, if your trend lines are wrong, if government spending grows faster than the private economy, you're in trouble, sooner or later. But if you do it the right way, and your private economy grows faster than government, then you can begin to afford to fix your tax system. You're beginning to leave more resources in the productive sector of the economy so that you're getting more efficiency and more economic growth. I had an article in the Wall Street Journal just last week where I wrote about a system that they have in Switzerland called the debt brake. And even though it's called the debt brake, what it really is, it's a cap on government spending, because it basically says that politicians can't increase government spending more than the average growth of tax revenue. So it's sort of like a cyclical balanced budget requirement. And as a result of that system, which has been in place since 2003, Switzerland has completely avoided the fiscal crisis. Government spending is falling as a share of GDP in Switzerland, not increasing like it is in the United States and other countries. So whether you decide that you want to try to address competitiveness through tax saving policies, whether you want to try to address competitiveness by going after the corporate income tax or the personal income tax, whether you want to boost competitiveness by trying to make the value-added tax a lower burden, these are all good policies. Remember, your goal is you want to reduce that wedge between what people produce and their living standards. Because if you work hard, but your living standards stay like this because the taxes take your money, it doesn't matter whether the taxes are value-added taxes, social insurance taxes, or income taxes. This is what economists call a tax wedge. The tax wedge is the difference between how much income you generate and what your living standards are. So I'm not playing favorites. there are lots of good tax reforms that can be done, but they all share one thing in common. They reduce that wedge. They make it so that of the income you generate, you get to enjoy higher living standards because it winds up money that you consume for your household, your family. And that I think is really the key message, is trying to figure out how to reduce that tax wedge, and how to reduce that tax wedge in a way where you're saying to international investors, international companies, to global capital markets, okay, we're making this reform because we want money to come to Ukraine. We're also going to deal with other problems like rule of law and property rights and regulation, but our goal is to make Ukraine 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, we're going to make Ukraine more like Hong Kong. That's what I always try to convince American politicians of, and that's the exact same advice I give here in Ukraine. So with that, I think I probably talked long enough, and usually the questions are more interesting anyhow, so...
Добре, але у нас, давайте як ми будемо задавати питання і виступати? Українською, хай перекладач перекладає йому, чи будемо практикуватися? Даємо англійською, так?
Ну, комусь складно, ми попросимо перекласти. Так,
добре.
англійською.
Тоді у нас був записаний виступ. Я надаю слово Юрію Гусєву, директор департаменту національних проєктів.
Let me introduce myself, okay? My name is Yuri Gusyev. I'm working in the State Agency for Investments of Ukraine, and I used to work in the Ministry of Economy of Ukraine, and I used to work with some concept of special economic zones of Ukraine. But I'd like to start with some another thing, because during I've been studying in Harvard Kennedy School. We had some case about Latin America country, about some municipal reform of the capital of some Latin American country, and that case was about how to reform some municipal economy, including a municipal tax system. And when we were working with the special economic zone concept of Ukraine, we're thinking what should we do with some different points in different regions of Ukraine to create some very good conditions for investments, engage in these zones to produce some export-oriented products, to make maybe some special economic zones for insurance, for banking system, etc., etc. And my questions to you, because I agree what you said about we have to have some balance between income, between some standards, etc. And I guess your advice will be very useful for Ukraine, but and I hope during your tomorrow conference a lot of officials from tax administration will hear your advice. But my questions is how to what do you think about special economic zones? Because in the United States you have in different states you have different tax system. Even in some island you have some free zones for banking, for insurance, etc., etc. What do you think? What should Ukraine do with some special zones? Because we had some very bad experience in special economic zones, because we had a lot of corruption, a lot of other bad things during first period of special economic zones between 1992 till 2005. But when I studied some experience from different countries, including United States, including some European Union countries, even from Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is a part from China, you know, and Hong Kong has some absolutely different system, economic system, tax system, and Hong Kong has more successful system than China in general. Should we do some special economic zones like pilot points, include Ukraine for engaging investment, for making some I don't know, some good climate zones for money, for saving money, I don't know. What should we do with this thing? Or even we should change some system totally from the top to...
Yeah. Well, here's the challenge. If you have, remember I said the 3 principles of good tax policy: low rate, no double taxation, no loopholes. No loopholes implies you don't want special economic zones. But if you look at some countries, like Panama with the Cologne Free Trade Zone, some countries have been very successful with these special carve-outs. Yes, there are loopholes. Some countries have been very successful with tax holidays. So if you want to build the insurance industry in Ukraine, and you want Ukraine to become a regional hub, so that you're selling products into other former Soviet republics or even down into the Arab countries or something like that. Maybe you want a 10-year tax holiday on insurance or whatever you pick. As an economist, part of me doesn't like that because I want the rules to be neutral and fair to everybody. And once you start doing a carve-out, a loophole, well then, maybe the industries are going to come to the politicians, give them some money under the table, say, here, give us a special carve-out. And when you go down that path, you run the risk of creating corruption, but some countries have done it successfully. So, what's my advice?
I will say you agree, okay?
Well, I would say that if you go down that path, actually, one thing I'll warn you about is that the WTO is beginning to be, if you're doing things like transshipment zones and things that are supposedly affect trade, the WTO, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, may be shutting those things down. But if you're simply talking about tax holidays, special tax regimes that aren't trade related, you don't have to worry about the WTO. But whatever you do, it should be, you should try to make sure it's as transparent as possible, where there's no discretion for the bureaucracy. Because once there's discretion for the bureaucracy or for the politicians, that's what creates the climate where corruption can fester. So have a system, America has 50 states, we have federalism. So some states like Delaware's the biggest tax haven in the world actually, even bigger than Switzerland. But what makes Delaware so special is that there's no room for the bureaucracy. You go online, you fill out a form, you pay $100, and you have a company. That's it. And there's no reporting requirement, no sharing of beneficial ownership if it's an LLC. So Delaware has specialized in company formation and company law, but in a way where the politicians and the bureaucrats can't extract bribes or anything like that. And so if all someone has to do is go onto the internet, sign up for the special economic zone for insurance, and we're just using that as an example. It could be banking, it could be manufacturing, whatever. They go online, they fill out a form, they make some reasonably low payment, and then they have a 5-year license or whatever. That would be very important, is to make sure the system is transparent and doesn't give politicians and bureaucrats discretionary power.
I have another question. It's according to my speech, okay? You have 50 different states in United States. 52? except Ukraine and Poland.
Obama said 57, but we only have 50. He also said Austrian was a language.
50 different states. In European Union we have 27 different countries. And each country has each tax system. How does economic rule work in this very complicated system? Because you have in Delaware some special regime for small and medium business. Does it mean that all small medium business focus on Delaware or not? And how does it work in European Union? Because in Germany you have high tax than in Bulgaria, I don't know.
Well, what you're talking about is what we refer to as federalism. And the best example in Europe isn't the European Union, it's Switzerland. Because Switzerland has a central government, but most taxes and spending occur at the canton and municipal level. And so there's lots of competition inside Switzerland where businesses and people will move from one canton to the other. And the US still has some of that, but not as much as we used to. We've centralized too much power. And that was a big mistake in our country. And so we should go back to being like Switzerland, where the responsibility for these things is at the state and local level. And I don't know what type of system Ukraine has, but if you have different regions and districts or whatever you call them, you should shift power down to the region and local level and tell the regions and localities, okay, you're in charge of schools, you're in charge of sewer systems, you're in charge of roads, whatever. So you raise the money, you make the decisions. People in Kiev aren't going to tell you what to do. I think that's a very good approach because it means that government is closer to the people, and I think it works better. But also I think it's good because then the local governments compete with each other, the regional governments compete with each other, just like Ukraine competes with other national governments. So this is part of the work I've been doing for years on tax competition and tax havens. I want governments to feel competitive pressure. We have that in the US, not just on companies. Because of course, yes, Delaware, in addition to Nevada and a few other states, are very good places to register your company. Now, where you register your company isn't the same as where your headquarters are, or where your factories are, or where you do your business. It's just where you domicile your company. But we also have much broader forms of competition. California has a very high state income tax, 11%. Nevada, right next door, has 0.
So the recent article about Apple trying to make tax evasion because of this closeness of California and Nevada.
Yeah, but it's not tax evasion.
Well,
it's simply...
Well, they're accusing of Apple not paying around $2 billion, but the company like Apple is so big.
Well, what they're doing is they're accusing them of not giving the government as much money as the politicians want.
Yeah, exactly.
That is good, because the people in America that will spend money least responsibly are the politicians. And I suspect that the people in Ukraine that will spend money least responsibly are probably the politicians. You know, it's not because they're bad people. James Buchanan won his Nobel Prize in economics for something called public choice, which is the analysis of incentives in the political system to do the wrong thing. So even though politicians usually are people, they're usually charismatic, you know, that's why they become politicians, they have some energy, positive energy, and so, but a political system, because you sort of get votes by bribing people with their own money, it leads to this incentive system where government keeps getting bigger. And you look at what's happened in Western Europe with the fiscal crisis, it's public choice. And it's going to happen in America. Just, you know, 20 years later or whatever, you know, I don't want to make a prediction because who knows. But one of the ways you sort of counteract this public choice incentive of politicians to spend too much money is you set up this decentralized system where governments are competing with each other, and then if California politicians want to become like Greece, and they think, okay, well, I'm going to tax Apple, and then we're going to buy more votes by giving more people welfare, then all of a sudden Apple says, forget it, and they walk to Nevada.
But the point is that there are different companies. They were talking about fairness between the companies that produce real goods and companies like Apple that sells mostly like iTunes.
It's real,
not real goods, yes? Not real goods.
Real goods.
It's not real goods.
You know, that deals with the governments for hundreds of years have taken advantage of what are called elasticities. If you have, what's one thing that governments love to tax? Property, land. Why? Because land can't walk away. So it's very easy for governments to tax land and to tax land at a high rate because land can't go anywhere. It's very hard for governments to tax investment at a high rate because investment, you get on your computer, all of a sudden your investments are in the Bahamas or the Cayman Islands. Labor, you can tax labor higher than property, or no, you tax it less than property because labor can move, but it's not as easy for labor to move as for capital to move. And so there have always been, throughout hundreds of years, politicians levying higher or lower taxes on different types of activity simply based on whether that activity can escape. And that's what's happening with Apple. Here's another good example, the mining industry. The mining industry in most countries gets hit with very heavy taxes. Why? Because you build a mine that's a very high fixed cost capital investment that's trapped at a certain type of property. And so governments can in effect act like a monopolist and say, you're going to pay us this much tax. Whereas Apple, with digital products, so is it unfair? Yes. The mining company pays more tax than Apple, but what's unfair is that the government is exploiting its power to tax the mining company. I don't blame Apple, I blame the government for taxing Walmart. That was the other example in that article. Yes. Walmart pays a higher tax than Apple. Well, the solution isn't to bring Apple up here, the solution is to bring Walmart here.
Right. I have also one well, several questions, and I exchanged it for, well, I should have a speech, but instead of that, I would inform you, maybe you know, that VAT tax in Ukraine is the most criminal tax, and it is criminal from the beginning to the end. So tomorrow, if you have the opportunity, please talk about that. In fact, even the advisors, they say Ukrainian economy will start boosting after you cope with the VAT tax. So the problem is very critical, and in fact it stops everything which could happen here. So the question about that, there are several possibilities. For example, the economists here in Ukraine calculated that if we would decrease very quickly, immediately, the VAT tax to the level of 5, maybe not more than 7%, then the criminal and corruption cases about that tax, which is in fact a business as itself, you know.
What is the normal VAT rate right now?
20. But it should be decreased every year to 1%, which doesn't work. I mean, what the experts say, if we decrease VAT immediately to 5%, then there is no return, I mean, to make corruption about that, because there are different sort of corruption schemes which are used to sell. In fact,
yeah, like carousel fraud and things like that.
Yes, this is a fraud to sell VAT to the other companies. For example, the companies need well, so let's not talk about the accounts, but in any case, the question is whether you think it is possible to decrease VAT immediately and how to do that. Second choice is to eliminate VAT and to substitute VAT by turnover tax, so on the total revenue, which should be not more than 1.5%, which is calculated, and then it is very low, very simple, but there are some other drawbacks. What do you think about this kind of?
Let me do it in reverse order. If you do a turnover tax or a gross receipts tax, you have to understand that for some industries that means a much higher tax rate than others. So if you're an industry with lots of turnover, your effective tax rate compared to your actual income is going to be a lot higher than for other types of companies.
So which industries are there? Industrial? For example, let's talk about kind of software, Apple company or any other. They don't have high tax. They will be easy for them to pay this tax and to be taxed like this. If we follow the way that the economy should be post-industrial, not industrial as it is in Ukraine, then that's what the experts say. The turnover tax would be easier for that companies, and there will be a burden for the industrial sector.
The one thing that you have to worry about, I think, because nobody talks about this idea in the U.S., so I don't spend much time on it, but when I do spend time on it, people almost always say, you're going to kill the financial services industry. Because how do you apply a gross receipts tax on the financial services industry? If it's something like a transaction tax or something like that, you wind up, because there's always so much churning in the financial services industry, just by virtue of different positions, different investments, money going into overnight funds, coming back in the next day. Depending on how you structure the tax, you can set up a system where you create a giant incentive for all your banking, insurance, finance to just leave the country. So you have to be very careful about some of these things. But I'm not going to pretend that I know enough about it, because it's never been a proposal in the U.S., so I haven't done enough work. But on your broader question about, I agree with you. If you're going to try to reduce the VAT 1% a year, it's not going to have the kind of good shock value. You have a patient that's maybe having a heart attack, and you want to, after 15 years, you're going to be down at 5%. The patient's probably going to say, here, we'll just cut my wrist so the suffering ends now. The problem is, if you're going to go to 5% or go to 0, well, then we get back to that question about if government is too big, and then you're proposing to cut a tax that maybe gives you 20% of your revenue. I don't even know what the figures are.
No, it is stolen. In fact, the idea is that the government which you talk about is stolen already until it goes to the people, to the society. So calculations say that the VAT in half a year will increase because people will pay it, so the level of shadow economy will decrease drastically. That means the government will increase instead of being decreased.
Well, what you're doing is you're talking about a Laffer curve argument.
Yeah.
And the Laffer curve simply says that if tax rates are too high, the government will actually lose some money. Is there actually a...
Yes.
I was going to see. All right, look at this. I'm going to make this... This right here is the Laffer curve. If your tax rates are 100% and 0, how much money do you collect with a 0% tax rate? This is your tax revenue, and this is your tax rate. If you have a 0% tax rate, you collect zero revenue. If you have a 100% tax rate, does anybody work? Does anybody? No. So you collect zero. And so the argument is that maybe the value-added tax right now is here. You lower it to here, you'll actually collect more money.
Yeah.
Now, this actually happened, in the U.S. With income taxes during the Reagan years. When Reagan first took office, we had a 70% top tax rate. That 70% top tax rate, and this is all data on the IRS website, something called the Income Bulletin. In 1980, with a 70% tax rate, rich people, those making $200,000 a year or above, rich people paid the IRS $19 billion with a 70% tax rate. Reagan took the tax rate all the way down to 28%. And the left-wingers said that's not fair, rich people won't pay enough, the government will be starved of revenue. What happened? In 1988, when the tax rate was all the way down to 28%, rich people paid $99 billion of revenue to the government. So, $19 billion of revenue with a 70% rate, $99 billion of revenue with a 28% rate. So that was the Laffer curve on steroids. That was the Arnold Schwarzenegger Laffer curve. Now, it's an empirical question. You never really know how sensitive a tax is, or how sensitive taxpayers are to a tax. Even with hindsight, we don't know, because maybe there were other factors that caused taxable income and tax revenue to go up from the rich during the Reagan years. So how much of it can you credit to the lower tax rates? I think a lot, but not all of it. And if you lower the value-added tax rate, people will have more incentive to obey the system. There'll be less opportunities for corruption. But here's where you're going to have a problem. The IMF and people like that aren't going to want you to get any credit for those Laffer curve effects. The IMF is very dogmatic, I'm not joking when I say the IMF assumes if you double tax rates, you double revenue.
Yeah, I know. Well, the question about the opposite thing, protectionism. So China achieved great success in having many manufacturers producing their goods on the territory of China and then exporting it throughout the world. There was one thing, it was cheap labor, but not the main thing. The main thing was the incentives which were given to the companies which have their factory or enterprise, factory on the territory of China. What we discussed as Minister of Economy, we discussed it with the Ministry of Finance and also with the IMF representatives. If we want, for example, we need car parts industry here. To start that, we have to increase some protectionist barriers. In this case, the companies will go to manufacture. If we don't do that, well, which happened since we joined WTO, then all the businesses disappear. They just go to Romania, to Poland, to Slovakia, to all neighboring countries because they, this is a different story, because they are EU members and they have this first thing which you mentioned first, the property rights protection, very high and very safe, everything is okay.
European foundations for development.
And also, yeah, but the main thing that it is safe. Ukraine is not safe, so we have to give the investors some other things which could possibly substitute. So we could not attract investment by this way, but not even, we cannot think about that, because whatever we try to show as, look, we need jobs here. To have jobs, we need some manufacturing here, like in China, like it used to be in Poland 10 years ago. No. So what is your opinion about that? do we have any chances, being a member of WTO, we are very soon the members of free trade agreements with Europe, do we have any chances to use this instrument to, to increase jobs?
You won't be able to do direct protectionism because that would be off the table. I would think your best strategy, even though, as I said before, I don't really like it, would be tax holidays. You tell a manufacturing company, you come here for 10 years, you have zero tax on your profits.
So loopholes.
It's a loophole. Well, what I would rather do is just have. The problem is you don't have a Hong Kong-sized government, so you have to figure out narrower approaches. So a narrow approach is just do a tax holiday for this industry or for manufacturing. That's what we would call a second best solution. The first best solution is to have modest-sized government, a low-rate Hong Kong-style flat tax. That's obviously much better, but that's, you know, getting from where you are now to Hong Kong is a long and difficult challenge, whereas a tax holiday you can do tomorrow. And so even though I don't think it's the right tax policy, if you're looking for short-term steps that can maybe bring in manufacturing and bring in manufacturing in a way where you're not getting in trouble on free trade agreements, that's probably
right.
The best.
Guys, now the questions.
I'm sorry, I have to go. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Government officials usually leave early.
Holidays.
My name is Krivdik. I'm a political expert. I'm not too much into the economics, but still I have a question, and I hope that my knowledge of economics will be enough to understand your answer. My question refers to the Hungary's experience when they put a constitutional norm into the legislation that government cannot spend more money than government can't spend more than it collects. How do you estimate this norm? Do you know about this legislation in Hungary?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
And what do you think about this? Because to my mind, it's to some extent antisocial. As soon as the social programs need spendings and there is a need to borrow money for that, what do you think of that?
Well, whatever Hungary has, it's not working very well because they're trying to get money from the IMF and their economy's in trouble. So Switzerland's debt break, I think, works a lot better. Or Hong Kong system, where there's just a cap of government spending of no more than 20% of GDP. Those systems work better. Now, maybe they work better because Hong Kong and Switzerland are just different types of countries. I don't know. That's sort of a chicken and egg problem. But what I will say is that the best social policy is a private sector job. And there's a problem in a lot of Europe where people say that you're somehow bad or mean or heartless if you want to control government spending. But the reason to control government spending is to prevent a country from becoming Greece. Greece is now a very anti-social economy because they've become bankrupt. It's much, much better to have a system like Switzerland or Hong Kong where you cap government spending. And maybe government spending grows 2% a year, and maybe all the different interest groups want it to grow 5% a year, and they're going to say you're mean, you're antisocial, you're not nice. But you know what? Your economy is going to be healthier, it's going to grow faster, it's going to create more jobs. And I think it's very important for anybody who's in economics or politics. We have an obligation, a responsibility to educate people. You can't have a long-term, prosperous economy if government spending is growing faster than the private sector. That means you have to put government on a diet. Now, Nobody likes being on a diet. We all want to eat hamburgers and drink milkshakes and ice cream and eat cake and pie all the time. It's no fun to be on a diet, but you're much, much healthier as a result. And I think the analogy for countries is, if you don't want to wind up like Greece or Spain, if you don't want to wind up like, you know, Hungary's in very deep trouble, you have to actually figure out policies that have that government spending within a cap. Because that's really what that rule is about. Government spending grows slower than the private economy. You're really talking about saying government should only grow 2% a year or something like that. And yes, people will say that's antisocial in the short run, but it's very social in the long run. Again, you know, poor people in Switzerland are much better off than poor people in Greece. Even though Greece has a much more social economy. Because you have more private sector growth in Switzerland, and that's much better for people in the long run.
Right, next please.
Okay. This is very loud now about the Georgian reforms. It's very popular talk in Ukrainian pro-liberty group about the Georgian way and the possibility to copy the system that was established last several years. Maybe you know something interesting about the tax system in Georgia.
The Republic of Georgia. Not the state of Georgia.
Yes, no, I
what is your opinion about the reforms of Saakashvili, and they improve your proposition like a tax holidays and so on and so on. Do you think this is working? Because there are a lot of criticism from the other European sides that they are have a lot of donation from the American side, they have too much borrowing from the IMF and so on.
I've been to Tbilisi a couple of times, and I've worked with the people at the new economic school there, and met with the government officials. What I always advise, because obviously just making a couple of trips to a country and meeting with some people, that doesn't make me an expert. But what I always do, anytime someone asks me about a country, before I came to Ukraine, I went to the Economic Freedom of the World Index from Fraser. I went to the Index of Economic Freedom from Heritage. I looked at the IMF, what they're called Article 4 country reports, I think. There's all these different pieces of data out there. The World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. Just look at the countries that over time are rising, and what are you going to find in all these different indexes and measures? The countries that are rising, and that means doing better policy, they're also the ones that are growing faster, creating more jobs, creating more prosperity. Now, does that mean that Georgia is perfect? No. I think the last I saw, they were still around like 30 or 35. Which obviously is a big improvement over where they were 10 years ago and 15 years ago. So Georgia, like Slovakia, like Estonia, there have been some countries, transition economies, that are sort of seen as having done a better than average job. And I would just look at those countries and figure out, okay, what did they do right? Look at the countries that haven't done such a good job. And to be honest, you know, Ukraine of transition economies ranks more toward the bottom in terms of not really having improved its score. And again, you know, the real problem area is rule of law, property rights, regulation. You know, that's the one thing I remember from looking at these different reports is that's, you know, so even though I'm here to talk about taxes and fiscal policy.
But you mentioned it's 10%.
Yes, well, taxes 10%, spending 10%, fiscal policy combined 20%, but you know, you have these other issues that are really important that have to be solved. And that's actually still where Georgia has challenges. You know, if you look at their grade on these 5 different measures, those are the 2 measures that they still are weak. And that I think is a legacy problem of a political culture that was communist controlled, and then even before that was, you know, just controlled by whoever the local leaders were. And so, you know, developing rule of law and property rights is a form of social capital, and it's very difficult to just, you can't, it's not like flicking a light switch. So, so how do you actually get it to happen? Well, some countries have done it by joining the EU, because you're importing a lot of bureaucracy, you're importing a lot of rules, none of that's good, but you're also importing rule of law and property rights. Doesn't work perfectly, Romania and Bulgaria don't do it as well as other countries, but
Right, next please. Good luck. Video. Please, any questions?
Brother, you say this the most important problem is the rule of law, and I would explain to you how it actually works with, like, I'm a practicing lawyer.
Your name.
And I will explain to you why we're still developing, but we actually develop an English system, English law system rather than we do for Ukraine, because we have one loophole, is that Cyprus companies in Ukraine, Cyprus has a very favorable double tax treaty with Ukraine, basically zero taxes on dividends, interest, and royalty payments. So it means you can, and of course a Ukrainian citizen cannot be an owner of a Cyprus company without having an approval from the government, but in fact nobody cares about that approvals, and they still establish those Cyprus companies for doing business in Ukraine. That's why Cyprus is probably the biggest investor into Ukrainian economy. And mostly Ukrainian lawyers, they do develop legal system, but they do it with the look at the English system, because most of the business is done through the Cyprus SPVs, and a lot of transaction is done at that level. So maybe that's the problem. Maybe the key question now would be closing this loophole because it's very, you can see that it's backed up by the government itself, because they have all this hidden interests in the businesses.
Well, but here's I'm not sure you want to shut that down, because
that's the only way you can get to the capital markets right now.
Yeah, because there was some research by a couple of American economists at the University of Michigan and University of Connecticut, where they found that having a tax haven nearby helped a non-tax haven economy grow faster. And the reason is actually kind of simple when you think about it. If you want to invest in Ukraine, but you don't really trust the local institutions, but you can invest in Ukraine by using a Cyprus company, and you feel more comfortable about protecting your property rights that way, well, all of a sudden you'll start investing. But if you don't have the Cyprus company, you might not invest at all. And that means fewer jobs, less growth. So Cyprus, just like Switzerland actually helps France and Germany grow faster, even though French and German politicians hate Switzerland. Switzerland helps those countries grow because it gives French and German taxpayers a way of investing money in their own economy that otherwise they wouldn't invest. And Cyprus, I think, probably helps the Ukrainian economy grow. But in the long run, it would be good to develop the institutions so that people no longer felt they had to use Cyprus companies. It'd be nice if so many people in America just go online and create a Delaware company. Because the law, the rules, everything is so clear and simple and neutral and transparent. Well, if that could happen in Ukraine, then that would be more efficient than having to go do a Cyprus company. But part of that involves then what are the tax laws, what are the corruption levels and things like that.
Please, next.
По-русски. Эдуард Курганский, Ассамблея общественных организаций малого и среднего бизнеса. Ассамблея общественных организаций малого и среднего бизнеса. На наш взгляд, наибольшая проблема экономики Украины – это ее высокий уровень коррупции. Даже порция.
Я вас перебью. Порция, пожалуйста.
Соответственно, бизнес находится в тени, есть оценки, что три четверти бизнеса находится в тени. И одним из важных факторов, почему бизнес уходит в тень, как уже говорилось, является НДС. Одним из выходов, которые видят эксперты, это замена НДС на налог с продаж. Даже если поступления от налога будут такими же, но будет огромный выигрыш о том, что мы уйдем от коррупционных схем. Можете ли вы сравнить эти два налога и те риски, которые связаны с переходом от НДС к налогу с продаж?
By trade tax, do you mean taxes on international trade or trade taxes, turnover taxes?
Turnover tax. That was my question, but it's connected now with corruption.
Yeah.
So how to decrease the level of corruption?
I confess I've never looked at turnover taxes and whether they're more insulated or protected from corruption. Because as I was saying in the answer to the other question, turnover taxes aren't an issue in the U.S., so I've never studied them. But certainly, if it's a much simpler, more neutral system, that should make it harder for it to create corruption. But then I would still warn that you do have these problems in the industries that have a high degree of turnover relative to income. If you have lots and lots of turnover and this much income in one industry, very little turnover and this much income in another industry, then obviously the tax rate on this industry is going to be very low, and the tax rate on this industry relative to income is going to be very high. And I already warned in the case of the financial services industry, that could really be a major problem for your economy. So my honest answer is I don't know enough to say for sure, but I will just warn you that no country does this. And there's probably a reason no country, I mean, obviously some countries have turnover taxes, like U.S. states have sales taxes, but they're always like 5% or something like that. Once you start getting into higher tax rates, and maybe this is really the problem, the tax rates are so high. And that was one of my first lessons. If you keep your tax rates low, however you're doing it, whether it's a social insurance tax, income tax, VAT, turnover tax, if your tax rates are low, not a big problem. If your tax rates are high, it's a big problem. That's the simple answer to every question that I get. Keep the tax rate low. So I don't know enough to really say on turnover taxes and how it would interact with corruption, but I do know enough to say that if you have your tax rates very low, the problems sort of solve themselves.
Right, please. Who's next? Well, I have a question about the tax for developing the corn or coal or oil. So in fact, the problem of post-Soviet economies, from one side, the industrial character of that economy. But since last 20 years, the process of deindustrialization was very strong. So now what we have the remnants of the industrial economy, and we don't have enough SMEs which work in new technological levels. So in fact, the technological export of Ukraine is only 4% of the export. Even during the Soviet period, it used to be 25–30%. And it is decreasing. On some estimates, it is even if we calculate it correct, then it is 1.5% only. So there is also the idea between the experts that we tax the mines, whatever it is, and we distribute the taxes to the venture companies, to every and other possibility to invest and to prepare infrastructure for investments into higher technological levels. This is one part of the question, and the second part is about the tax havens. For example, we have a very open use of tax havens by at least two major financial industrial groups when the owner lives in Switzerland and uses all the system of Swiss tax system to avoid paying taxes. The system is as simple as that. He has a company on his name here in Ukraine. Then he has a company on his name or of his relatives in Switzerland. Well, in fact, relatives here and himself in Switzerland. So he sells on a low price the goods from Ukraine to Swiss company, and that Swiss company sells it to the open market. Easy as that, and absolutely open. So this is why the tax on the
Minor companies.
Yeah, mining of different
Industries.
Yeah, mining industries. So that is why the tax on specific branch, specific sector, as this mining, is so important that first, it could be then used, the money could be used for infrastructure, for new technologies, for the investors in new technologies, making technological parks, whatever. Second, it's not possible to work by using the income tax or corporate tax, all the taxes which are usual European taxes, which could be paid by Ukrainian company. But this tax is paid on the low level, or on low price, which is that used, the normal price is used by the Swiss mother company, in fact. So this is open system which exists, and what do you think, whether first tax which I mentioned could exist, whether it's right, and second, whether we can cope with the financial industrial group by taxing them here in Ukraine on the 1 ton of goods, whatever, very simply.
The second question is basically transfer pricing rules that were...
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Arm's length relations with the Swiss company, but the problem is that they don't disclose the owners, so you can actually see if that is a related company or not. But this is like more a technical question, isn't it?
Well, so this is my question. I need an answer.
No, the point is that the system
if you want to answer, then you can answer.
No, I mean, just the system is broken. It's that we cannot control our citizens being owners of other corporations abroad, which offshore, and they don't disclose that. They don't disclose that they own.
That's why I ask whether we can use this tax not to disclose, because this is. In fact, this is a break in the law of Switzerland to that citizens, which are citizens of Switzerland. So I don't want to have anything with that matter, which is absolutely legal. So that's why I say my country taxes not the person, but the goods. That was my question.
Yeah. Well, first, part of the question is transfer pricing. And the U.S. and other countries, you know, it doesn't really matter whether if you're going to do arm's length pricing, it doesn't really matter whether you know the company overseas is related or not. It just you just make a determination that's not a market price. Now, of course, there are games and there's potential corruption, and we don't do it right in the U.S. Nobody probably does it right, but it's not an uncommon problem. It exists in every country in the world. If you have a low corporate tax rate, people want to declare income where you are. If you have a high corporate tax rate, people want to declare expenses where you are. So that's just an argument for having a low corporate rate. But in terms of the issue of how to tax, and you're talking about mining, extractive industries.
Extractive industries. So we have the richest in Europe iron ore. Well, so this is
and I
more or less 45 million tons a year. It used to be number 4 in the world.
Well, then I would agree. It's better to have a severance tax, you know, which could be just a tax per ton. You know, severance, just different ways of doing a severance tax. A severance tax is better than a corporate income tax in that regard. So the question is, if you do a severance tax, what do you do with the money?
Investment to infrastructure for new towns.
Well, but what does that mean? Does it mean that politicians, a special fund that politicians control and then get bribes to give money to special companies? You have to be very careful. If you have a new tax and politicians are supposed to use it to help the economy grow, it's like putting spoiled food out. You know that cockroaches are going to come, or rats. So if you have a new fund where the politicians get to pick the winners, then you're probably going to get corruption out of that. What I would suggest as a better alternative is, okay, you have this extractive tax, use it to lower the VAT. Use it to lower the social insurance tax. Use it to lower the corporate income tax.
So you don't believe to build infrastructure?
Well, yes, but depends what you mean by it. If by building infrastructure means that your sewer systems get upgraded, your ports get modernized, you build better roads, yes, I believe in that. You know, most government spending is wasteful, but physical and human capital spending can be productive, assuming that politicians do it right, which of course is...
Right, so by you, if you put it on the balance, you say better decrease the other taxes if you have more money from the money tax, like this. But
but I also agree that if your roads are crummy, if your ports are falling apart, if your railroads, you know, I mean,
Look, we in the Ministry of Economy, for example, we have a project with the Japanese, for example, which I mean, it's not a project, it's an advice. Which port to build in each, to widen in each place. In any case, they are ready to invest like 70%, but in any case, the government should spend 30%. That cannot be the other way. So, in any case, if we talk about the infrastructure.
You know, I mean, like in Panama, that I'm very familiar with because I'm there many times, you know, the Chinese companies are running the major ports. And so the Panamanian taxpayers don't have to pay anything. They give a concession. Matter of fact, they charge for the right to have the concession at the port. So there are ways of getting that physical capital in your economy sometimes. You know, the railroad companies should build and maintain the railroad tracks because they can charge and get the benefit from it. The company running the port can charge the fees for unloading cargo. Building highways, more challenging. You have, you know, property taxes on cars, taxes on gasoline. But yes, physical capital is important for an economy. But what I was worried about when you were saying infrastructure was the idea of government having some sort of fund that would then invest in a high-tech company. Well, I would worry that it will invest in the companies of people who give contributions to the politicians, either above the table or under the table. So investing in infrastructure, good. Investing in picking winners and losers in the economy, bad.
Right.
Cooking the books like Greece
Next.
did. Like Greece did cooking the books with Goldman Sachs. That's what. Have you heard about that?
Yes.
Please, your question.
Yes, I have a comment because I understand that it's not only questions and answers, but rather sharing the experience. I would add up to what you've been talking, like also said about the situation in the U.S. that it's hard to convince politicians to lower the tax and control spending. In Ukraine, it's aggravated by the situation that our politicians have started, so to say, a race to the bottom. They all wanted to, like you said, bribe voters with their own money, and they spent a lot of money for all this, sometimes even unrealistic social stuff, like paying pregnant women $1,000. Well, I mean, it would be realistic in some time if we had the proper growth for them, but they just do this stuff, and they basically, like probably the U.S. is only raising the deficit. And what they do now, for all these purposes, they tax businesses in advance. I don't know if that happens anywhere in the world, but they just come to the companies and say, that's your plan, that's what you should give us in 1 year. We don't care. We will find any formal reasons to tax you at this rate, and we don't care what you do. We need it, and we need it now because the campaign is starting, and we should do it now. So it's it's good that we talk about all this lowering taxes. But I don't see this happening until we educate people about that, not just politicians, because they probably know that. People should know that. People should control that, and then maybe change this. People change the government, maybe different politics and stuff, because they were very successful in bribing middle class, everybody, because they give all this free stuff, which then they took from those people who actually did good. They created jobs. They did business. So that's my pessimistic view.
Well, I share that pessimism. I worry a lot about what I see. No solution to some of these Western European economies. I worry that the U.S., as I already said, will be in the same situation. And that's a fundamental problem. In all of our countries, we have to convince people that government isn't a free lunch. That government can it can't give me $10 without taking $10 from somebody else. And usually when government plays that game, they destroy another $10 in the process. So everybody winds up poorer in the long run. But it's sort of like the Laffer curve thing. I mean, that's why the Cato Institute exists. We're trying to educate Americans about how government is trying to bribe you with your own money, and you wind up losing, and they wind up winning, and that's bad. But yeah, no, if I knew the answer to that question, I would be doing it.
Yeah, my question is quite general in the field of the prognosis. What is your prognosis about the nearest future of the world economy? What about the nearest, your nearest look for the so-called financial economical crisis?
Second wave.
Yeah, is it possible how it's effective on your country, our country? Towards another question, there are a lot of discussions about the free capitals. Then, in the time of the crisis, there are really not too much capitals to have investment. We have in several days before in some discussion that some officials from the government, Ukrainian government, said there are no monies to have an investigation in Ukraine, in the world. But what is your position? Where we can find money? In what countries? In what hubs? I don't know. What direction we can use this money? to build plants or, I don't know,
agriculture,
farming, agriculture, or something else?
Well, if I knew what was going to happen to the global economy, I'd be investing and become rich. And then I'd go live in the Cayman Islands and never have to worry about anything again. So I can't predict the economy. I do think that, well, I am very pessimistic about these Western European economies. In the short run, the thing to look at is whether the Germans are stupid enough to bail them out and to do something like Eurobonds or do a fiscal transfer union. But if I was a German taxpayer and Merkel did that, I would move to Switzerland right away and I would give up on my country. Now, is Merkel dumb enough to do that? I don't know. Hollande is probably going to win in France. Sarkozy is a socialist, but Hollande's a super socialist. So I assume that means that there's going to be pressure for Keynesian spending, which of course doesn't work. It didn't work for Hoover and Roosevelt in America in the 30s. It didn't work for Japan in the 1990s. It didn't work for Bush in 2008. It didn't work for Obama in 2009. But, you know, they'll start doing what they call growth, but of course bigger government isn't growth. And so these are the reasons why I'm pessimistic about Western Europe, is they still think that they can somehow live at someone else's expense. And until they learn that they can't do it, they're going to keep going. What should have happened 3 years ago is Greece should have been told to default. And that would have sent a very strong signal to Italy and Spain and Portugal and the others. But it's like if you have if you're walking through the supermarket with a little child who sees some candy and starts crying, I want candy, and you give the child some candy, what happens the next time you go to the supermarket?
More candy.
I want candy. So you give them 2 pieces of candy. The next time you have to give them 4 pieces of candy. And I think that's what's happening in Europe. There's just always this view that somebody else, you can reach into somebody else's wallet to keep everything going. And I don't know, I'm not happy. I'm not optimistic.
Next question.
My name is Taras Buk. I work for the International Republican Institute. Respectively, I have the question about how much your ideas are being supported in the US, and why Ron Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, who is probably the strongest supporter of your ideas, small government, low rate tax, and so on and so on, why he hasn't found the strong support enough?
Every Republican since Ronald Reagan has pretended to be for small government. But usually when they get power, for the reasons I talked about before, public choice theory, James Buchanan, Nobel Prize, things like that, you know, Bush was a big spender, even though he said he wouldn't be a big spender. Romney says he's very conservative, severely conservative was the phrase he used. I think Romney, if he wins, will be as bad as Bush. That's just my prediction. I hope I'm wrong. I do think Obama will win, so it's kind of irrelevant, my predictions on Romney. But if Obama wins, Republicans probably still hold the House. They probably do win the Senate, so we have gridlock for 4 years, which is good. That's what our founding fathers set up our system for. They wanted gridlock because if politicians couldn't get anything done, that would mean people were free. Now, so we have gridlock for 4 years. What does that mean 4 years from now for the 2016 election? Well, then all of a sudden, Ron Paul's not around anymore because even though he does believe very much in freedom, he's a 76-year-old man who talks about central banks. Nobody knows what central banks are. He sounds crazy. So even though it's a very important issue, we saw in the 1970s what happens when central banks get irresponsible. So he's talking about an important issue, but everyone thinks he's just, okay, he wants small government, but he's this old man who complains about something called a central bank, and people don't know what that is. But in 2016, his son, Rand Paul, may run, who's a senator from Kentucky. Marco Rubio, a new senator from Florida, may run. Paul Ryan, the chairman of the House Budget Committee, who put together a very good budget plan that fixes these entitlement programs and actually would, instead of America becoming Greece with government spending going like that, government spending as a share of GDP would actually begin to fall. So Republicans have had a bunch of fake conservatives pretend free market people ever since Reagan. In 2016, I actually think they will have some real conservatives, real free market people. So you work for the International Republican Institute. If I were you, I would go into hibernation for 4 years. You know what hibernation is, like a bear goes to sleep for the winter? Figure out some way to go to sleep for 4 years, because I think Obama wins re-election, but I think that...
I think we'll be close in that case in your case.
But I do think that in 2016, there's going to be a much more interesting set of candidates who I think have a much deeper belief in limited government and free markets. What America needs is another Reagan, not a pretend Reagan. And I think in 2016, there might be a real Reagan, actually a couple of real Reagans running.
A question back to Ukraine. In fact, the guys who gathered here, they are potentially Ukrainian Reagans here. So in fact, we have a changing of the generation in the politics. Nevertheless, it goes slow and not as successful as it should be. You all the time stress that we have to decrease taxes and possibly the budget will have more money. But then we have to have this pillar, to the fund, the money to substitute that the decrease of the tax collection until more companies pay more taxes. I'm quite serious. You say, and I believe that strongly, that IMF never changes the rules. So that's why when we talk, we decrease the taxes and we need money from IMF. We will not get money. Who can give us, well, not us, well, the guys, young guys who come to the parliament and to the government, and they are quite risky. Where we can expect to get to raise money to put it into the budget? Well, you know, technically, even private money can be in the budget, like $1, $2, $3 billion. Usually, we talk about that small amount of money which is needed for us to have risky step, you know, to decrease the taxes. If we decrease taxes immediately, having in mind that we have that $3 billion to back the budget, then it can be a magic here with this economy.
Well, the first answer to your question is that government is more than 40% of GDP. That's much too big. And so you could have what we call a win-win situation, get the benefit of lower taxes and the benefit of less spending by figuring out some way to control government spending. Politicians hate doing that, though. They'd rather figure out ways of, okay, if we're going to cut taxes, we want to cut taxes that might give us more money. But the IMF won't believe that. I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean by having a reserve money from the private sector. I don't know what you really mean by that. But in my mind,
I really mean what you said. So if IMF does not give, then somebody has to give.
Well, who? Bill Gates.
Bill Gates. Some advocate of normal free economy development. because we are in a vice circle, you know. We have poor nation, low spending, and then populist as politicians. So they do their populist politics with high taxes, with the shadow economy, then low taxes, low budget, poor nation, low consuming, and so we are running. So somebody, for example, young people who are sitting here, they can talk about just breaking this loop, this vice circle, by doing very quick changes like lowering taxes. Then they have immediate support of businesses, small and medium enterprises. They will support it. No support from the people who work in the mines or on a budget spending. I mean, like the government enterprise, the state enterprises. They will not support this. But small and medium, whatever small it is. I mean, we have a sector of small and medium enterprises, only 15% of the economy. 15%, which is very low, but they are strong, and they will have very strong support from this SME sector. And then immediate growth, but there should be some Bill Gates advocate of free economy here.
Well, I hope so. They're very, but you know, usually people who are billionaires become billionaires because they only invest money when they expect a return. So why would someone put up, you know, $1 billion or $2 billion for the Ukrainian budget? Yeah, that they might believe in free markets, they might like to see Ukraine do reform, but you're really asking them, are you willing to buy reform for $1 billion in a country you don't live in? I mean, they don't even spend $1 billion to buy reform in the U.S. So it's I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I guess it'd be nice if we had a bunch of billionaires out there who would do that. But I think more realistic is you just have to have you have to figure out an economic strategy that is going to get you fast results. And maybe it's, you know, negotiating ahead of time with Chinese and Japanese companies. There's lots of capital in the world. I mean, the world is awash in capital. I mean, Switzerland has negative interest rates on their government bonds. People are giving money to Switzerland just because they view Swiss bonds as at least something that's not going to collapse in value. So people would love to have productive ways to invest their money as opposed to paying Switzerland to hold it. But that means here in Ukraine, coming up with a strategy, what policies are you going to put in place? How are you going to get the political support for it? You know, I can't answer those questions in the U.S. And I spent 25 years trying because I have politicians who want government to grow faster than the private sector.
Yeah, but you need 100 times more than Ukraine. That's
Maybe several words about the Cato and what you are working about. And,
Okay, well here, let me give a commercial. Cato.org is the Cato Institute website. I think you've already sent some of the videos around, but if you go to YouTube and just type in Dan Mitchell, flat tax, Dan Mitchell, tax haven, Dan Mitchell, government spending, Dan Mitchell, Keynesian economics, I have about 40 different videos that are instructional videos. Also, I have a blog. Just go to Google, type in Dan Mitchell blog, it'll be the first thing that comes up, where a couple of times a day I write about different issues about the global. My blog is International Liberty, so most of what I write is about the U.S., but at least I try to make at least a third of my blog posts about what's happening elsewhere in the world. So I think those are hopefully useful websites to get more information about all these issues. And then, of course, you know, my email is just dmitchell@cato.org. You can get it from the Cato website, and so I'm always happy if people want to send an email. You know, I might not have the time to have lengthy conversations, but I usually at least have time to give a quick response on something, and that's what we're there for, to try to help educate on these things. So yeah, no, so thank you for the opportunity to talk about these things.
Thank you much. We have coffee and tea, and let's have some talk for 15 minutes because in any case we already have.
We want to say thank you our guests. Guys, it's very interesting to have you here and to talk with you different issues.
Well, thank you.